12 miles west of town, to Miscamin. At County 84, Frank turned right. We drove to the beach along the narrow, pebbly road, getting covered with new snow. It was now falling heavily. Frank's old windshield wipers creaked as they struggled to make a dent in it. The road felt soft and slippery under the tires of his truck, and the tall, dark trees closed in on either side of us. Getting nearer to the edge of the road, the farther north we went. I watched the deep ditches and the darkening woods apprehensively. I was not like my mother. I liked it better in town. The clouds and snow were too thick now to reveal a sunset. The last of the day ended as if someone drew a dark shade down over it. Tanya was not standing at the end of County 84 at Miscamin Beach, looking out over the frozen tree lake. We got out of the truck to check a ways down the shore, Frank shining his flashlight around on the rocks and trees and the tips of driftwood poking out of the snow. Then he left me standing in the dark as he walked out on the ice. This time of year, the snow-covered lake that spread out over Canada for almost 70 miles looked like any banked stretch of field in the county. It was impossible to tell precisely where the beach ended and the lake began. But starting not far out were small clusters of orange and yellow lights, a village of fish houses on the ice. That's where Frank would be now, shining his light around carefully to watch for auger holes and gut buckets, knocking on the wooden doors and asking if anyone had seen my mother. I hadn't wanted to go with him. In the daytime, I liked the winter lake. On a clear day, it was a dazzling blue and white world. Lots of families, kids packed into fat snowmobile suits, grandmothers in clodhopper boots and leather mittens passing around homemade donuts. But at night, the frozen lake was a different kind of place. More men, more parties. More snowmobiles ripping drunkenly around on the ice. I could see and hear them now, their mosquito whines, their sharp beams of white light. I didn't love standing alone on the dark shore either, listening for cracks in the brush. No, Frank said, when he came back. After the lake, on to all my mother's favorite meditation spots, the birch grove near Amisk Bay, the old school forest. Frank, should we call Jack? I said, when we came up empty. The more people who are looking for her. Frank frowned. If Jack finds her, then he's got to bring her in. I just think Jack could probably even track her phone, I said. Let's try Blueberry Hill, said Frank. She wasn't there. Before we pulled back onto 400, Frank lit a cigarette and smoked it as he drove with the window cracked. The car got very cold before he was done. He flicked the butt out onto the snow. Back on the highway, I sat as close as possible to the windshield to watch for the deer that with their stunned brown eyes might emerge suddenly like huffing, heaving battering rams out of the driving bits of snow. Frank turned again off 400, this time south on County 82. About a mile down, I said, "You think she'd come down here?" "You don't think so?" said Frank. "I didn't think she liked to," I said. We were coming up on the driveway to the farm my mother and my Uncle Aaron had grown up on. Uncle Aaron until he was 10, Tanya until she was my age. Their parents had died that year in a car accident. A semi hit an icy patch on Highway 400 and knocked them off the road. Tanya, Uncle Aaron had told me, was already beginning to get wild at that point. When their parents died, there was no one to rein her in. Uncle Aaron was sent to a suburb of Minneapolis to live with his aunt and uncle. Well, they asked Tanya to come too. She wouldn't. She was 18. No one could legally force her to go. Instead, she got her first job at Hawkins, the factory in Gabakana. That was where she met Frank. After a year of working together in the same department, rip and cut, they both left. My grandparents' 90-acre farm went to Tanya. After several years of never paying the property taxes, she lost it. Talking about the farm seemed to bother her. She never brought me there. At the driveway to the farm, I thought Frank had decided I was right. He didn't pull in. I waited for him to turn around. Instead, he kept driving south. After a mile or so, I said breathlessly, "Deer!" Frank braked slowly. We both peered ahead into the swirling black and white. "Sorry," I said. I felt silly. It was only a mailbox with a jaunty wooden pelican perched on the top. Frank put his foot back on the gas. The truck tires whirled for a second in the soft snow before catching on the blacktop. Then we kept going. What are you thinking? I said after a minute. Where to now? Well, let's just... Frank kept driving, looking straight ahead. For several miles, we still saw an occasional orange or yellow light a short distance off the blacktop. We met one car, inching through the snow like an insect through heavy soil. Then no more. No more house or yard lights either. At a narrow gravel road marked minimum maintenance, Frank turned right. It looked like a logging road. Really? I said. You think she'd come in here? In the winter? We were heading into thick woods. Frank didn't respond as the truck bumped slowly through the snowy ruts. We got stuck in one, and Frank rocked back and forth to get out. He was looking nervy again. He coughed and said quietly, Junie, I was really hoping we'd find her at Miskomin Beach. He made another turn, then another. Soon I had no idea where we were in relation to County 82. Frank coughed some more. Then he started to breathe heavily, fast, shuddering breaths. I hoped he wouldn't hyperventilate. If Frank lost it, then I'd have to be the one who got us out of here. And at the point in the storm when even more snow had fallen, and every tree and every turn looked even more like every other tree and turn than they did right now. Are you all right? I said. Frank, calm down. We couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. The darkness outside the reach of the headlights was complete, and the trees, a mix of tall pines and birch, seemed to be growing right on top of one another. Frank, where are we? Is this where you hunt or something? I asked him. Frank muttered something under his breath. What? I said. Still he didn't answer, but he kept muttering to himself in a soft but high, whimpery animal voice. And whenever he made another turn onto another road, almost always even narrower and bleaker than the one we'd been on before, he groaned and gritted his teeth. What is it? I said. What's the matter, Frank? At one point, we saw something unexpected ahead, the headlights of another vehicle. To me, it was a relief, a sign we were still in civilization. But not to Frank. He swore. Then he stopped in the middle of the road. Frank, what are you doing? Frank's whimper grew louder. Pull over and let him get by, I said. There's not enough room. The truck drew closer. Frank kept looking at it. What is wrong with you? Pull over, I said. A bright beam of green light shone from the bed of the truck out into the woods, and Frank let out a long breath. Finally, he cut it out with the strange creature sounds. He gave the truck some gas and moved to the right. The other truck squeezed by. It's okay, Junie, he said inside. It's just shiners. Who did you think it would be? The news that there were shiners in the woods didn't have a calming effect on me. Shining deer might be legal under some circumstances, but I'd always associated shining with the kind of hunter who didn't care about sensible rules, hunted out of season, carried a beer in one hand and a gun in the other, and slopped around the woods, aiming a blast at every leaf that quaked. Frank scowled at the truck as it passed. Stupid, he said. In this weather? He started driving again. I watched him. Who did you think it would be? I asked him again. Frank shifted in his seat, rolling his shoulders. He sniffed and wiped his nose with his fist. Your mother. I hoped it was your mother. You about shit yourself because you thought it was Tanya? I frowned, not at Frank's incompetent lie, but at my own lapse into language he would understand. The problem was, vulgarity made him more comfortable. Well, now you're just seeing things, Junie, he said with a greasy grin. Frank, I said, tell me the truth. Do you and Tanya sell drugs? Is that what this is about? It wasn't the first time I'd considered this not unlikely possibility. For a few years now, Tanya hadn't made a secret of the fact that she and Frank smoked pot. I often found her skunky stashes around the house. It would explain how she usually managed to make the rent. It could explain Frank's panic now. Did Tanya owe someone money? Was this someone after her? I'd asked Frank and Tanya about selling drugs before. I wasn't surprised at the answer. They were probably afraid that if they told me the truth, I'd turn them into the police. Who knows? Maybe I would have. No, of course not, Junie, Frank said. We had gone only about a mile more when Frank pulled over again. He turned off the engine and sat looking out his window, breathing deeply. I glanced around. What a surprise. Trees. Snow. What's this? I said. Why here? Frank was quiet. He put his hands on his knees and looked down at them. After another long moment, he said, June, maybe it's time we headed back. What are you talking about? I looked at him. Why? Frank only continued to sit very still in his seat. You came here for some reason. You think Mom's here? I said. Frank lifted his hand from his lap. He rested it on the key in the ignition. I said, I'm calling Jack. As I went to pull my phone out of my coat pocket, I felt Frank turn to look at me. Don't, he said. I looked at him, surprised. Frank's pleading tone had been replaced with a firmer one. I looked down at my phone. Well, it doesn't matter. I'm not getting a signal anyway. Are you? Frank didn't move to get his phone. No, he said. How do you know? I said. Check it. I don't want Frank to find her, Frank said slowly. I don't want Jack to find her, Frank said slowly. I'll find her. And I want you to stay in the truck. After a moment, he closed his eyes. He took his hand off the ignition and put it on the door handle. He exhaled, and I watched him. You don't want Jack to find her? I said. Why in the world not? Frank, what if she's hurt? Jack could get her to town much faster than we could. He could even meet us on 400. If you think she might be here, let's go look. And get your phone out and see if you're getting a signal. Just give me a minute, Frank said. His eyes were still closed. We sat for a few seconds in silence. Then I grabbed Frank's flashlight. I opened my door. June, Frank said, his voice as sharp as it ever got. Listen to me. Don't now. I left the passenger door open and crossed the road through the truck's headlights. Then I walked towards the woods. The wind was very cold on my face, the driving snow even colder. This way, I called. June, come on and get back in the truck. I heard his door open and shut. I hadn't gotten very far by the time he caught up. I was wading through the deep snow in the ditch. The thick tangle of brush on the edge of the woods was bent heavily under the snow. I did not see an easy way to crack and break my way through it. No trail. I began to try to make one. When a branch snagged the pom-pom on my hat and pulled it off, the wind seemed to whistle through one ear and out the other. I swept the flashlight beam on the ground until I found the hat, and without even shaking it, jerked it back on. A terrible cascade of snow slipped past my collar and rippled down my back. Frank was hovering just behind me. Once he reached out to tug on the back of my coat. I shook him off. Don't, he was back to begging. June, you don't want to. This way? I said. It wasn't long before I found out for myself. The trees were growing very close together here, but then there was a small clearing. I beamed the flashlight into the middle of it, and through the heavy flakes falling in the bright yellow light, I saw her, her long brown hair on the snow. You can buy the book. And now it's